Today, on the occasion of Teachers' Day, the Indian Express, in association with the Central Square Foundation, is here with a special segment at the end of this episode of Three Things. I, Niharika Nanda, will be in conversation with Ujjawala Meshram, a primary grade school teacher from Balaghat district of Madhya Pradesh, and Vinod, the project director for foundational learning reforms at CSF. The discussion will focus on the importance of foundational learning in a child's onward learning journey and future opportunities later on in life. Make sure to listen till the very end of this episode.
Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargava, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. In this episode, we talk about the rising number of undocumented Indians attempting to enter the US and the UK. We also talk about a case dating back to the emergency involving this newspaper. But first, we talk about the RSS, the ideological parent of the BJP. For over a year now, opposition parties have been demanding that the government should conduct a nationwide caste census. In fact, during the Lok Sabha polls, this demand had become one of the central planks of the opposition.
90% हिंदुस्तान जाति, 95% जाति जनगणना चाहता है. कौन चाहते हैं? दलित चाहते हैं, आदिवासी चाहते हैं, पिछड़ा वर्ग चाहता है, गरीब जनरल कास्ट के लोग चाहते हैं, माइनॉरिटी चाहते हैं, सब चाहते हैं, क्योंकि सब लोगों को यह पता लगाना है कि हमारी भागीदारी कितनी है, हमारी हिस्सेदारी कितनी है.
And even though the BJP has so far remained quiet about it, the RSS earlier this week said that it supported the idea. This was during a recent media interaction in which the organization's publicity in charge, Sunil Ambekar, also admitted that there were issues between the RSS and the BJP. To talk about the significance of these comments, Indian Express's Deeptiman Tiwary joins us. Deeptiman, when we talk about the caste census, tell us how exactly has the RSS articulated its support for it?
Basically, what it has said that there is no problem in collecting data on caste and subcaste in the country, and that it is a well-established practice. The government has done it before and can do it again. So in that sense, it has come forward and said that, we support the idea of caste census. But it has said that this exercise should only be used to reach government benefits to the people who actually need it, basically disadvantaged sections of society, and for taking welfare activities of the government to the people, or to basically correctly target, the disadvantaged communities through government schemes. So having said that, it has basically added a word of caution with that, saying that such data should not be used for elections or for politicking or electioneering.
As our society, Hindu society, we have the sensitive issue of our caste and caste relations. That is a very sensitive issue. So, and of course, it is an important issue of our national unity and integrity. So, it should be dealt very seriously, not just on the basis of electioning or election practices or politics. So, I think as RSS think, yes, definitely for all welfare activities, particularly addressing to the particular community or caste which is lagging behind, and so which is the special attention is needed to some communities and caste. So for that, if sometime government needs the numbers, it is a very well practiced. So government needs the numbers, it takes, earlier also it has taken, so it can take it, no problem. But it should be only to address the welfare of those communities and caste. It should not be used as a political tool for electioneering. And so
basically saying that, in a sense, one could say that it is saying that this data should not be used in the way that the Congress wants to use it, to argue that, look, it is only the upper caste who, dominate all the government jobs or educational institutions despite the reservations being there. And therefore, some drastic change in the constitutional mechanism of providing affirmative action needs to be brought in the country.
So the framing is essentially that of welfare.
Yes, the framing is essentially that of welfare, which actually does not serve the purpose that the opposition is looking at, because the opposition is looking at making a socio-political argument where it is saying that despite the constitutional provision of reservations, the backward castes and the disadvantaged or the depressed classes, say Dalits and tribals, are not getting their due. So the argument is that if there is a caste census, then we will know exactly how many castes are there, how many castes are in the backward classes. And so accordingly, there should be a redistribution of reservations, or probably reservations need to be increased, that it should breach the 50% mark. So that is because Rahul Gandhi is consistently making that 85% of the population is backward, 85% of the population is backward. And these are the disadvantaged classes which make maximum of the India's population, but they are deprived of their due. So he is making this reservation argument, which is also having some traction among the public, because Congress did pretty well based on these arguments, did pretty well in 2024 Lok Sabha polls.
And Deeptiman, has the RSS ever spoken about the caste census in the past?
It has not spoken about caste census per se in as clear terms. It has often broached the subject of caste and spoken about it, and caste discrimination and reservation, where it has consistently said that we need to end caste discrimination. It has argued in favor of continuing reservations, but it has always maintained that the kind of subclassification or issues of doing politics on the basis of caste is not good. It has said that, this creates divisions in the society, because let's remember, the RSS fundamental goal is to unite the Hindu society. So whenever the topic of caste, which is a very sensitive issue in the Indian society, whenever it comes up, it puts RSS in a uncomfortable position, because it can neither say that, we don't need to talk about caste at all, nor can it say there need to be no reservations or whatever. But at the same time, its ideology requires the Hindu society to be seen as one unit.
And in fact, the caste system does the opposite of that.
Exactly. What we often, in colloquial political terms, we call it mandal versus kamandal. So the mandal is always, the caste hierarchy of Indian society is a structural barrier to the Hindutva project.
And Deeptiman, this framing that the RSS has chosen, this framing of welfare, do we imagine that this would make it easier for the BJP to perhaps take up this issue now?
Well, this is the only way that the BJP can actually move forward, that have a socio-economic, probably a more scientific approach to it than what was taken in the 2011, because there is an argument about the 2011 socio-economic caste survey that it was totally jumbled up and did not have the full data on caste, and it would give a wrong picture of the caste structures in the society, and so this data was not made public. So probably it could take a more scientific approach to enumeration of such data, and probably come up with one data which it can use for social welfare and government benefits. Let's remember that this data is already being used by the government for welfare activities. So it is not something that will be new. What is going to be new is whether the government, after collecting such data, will make it public, because only then can there be any politics over it.
And Deeptiman, the other thing that we heard the RSS concede to was that there are issues between the RSS and the BJP. And we had heard murmurs about it during the elections and even before it. We had heard, for example, that RSS workers didn't come out and canvass for the BJP as much this time. So talk about what the RSS said regarding this and how specific was it?
Well, this was a Samanvay Baithak, which is a coordination meeting. So naturally, coordination between the BJP and the RSS, with the president of the BJP being present in the meeting and the chief of the RSS being present in the meeting, was discussed. And this question was asked to the spokesperson of the RSS, and he did not deny at all that there were any issues between the BJP and the RSS. Because when such question is asked, you're free to deny that there are no issues. But he said that whatever issues, he framed it in a way that fundamentally we both think the same way, and all arms of the RSS think the same way, that is, they think for the nation. But there are functional issues that come up, and these functional issues are sorted out through discussions, and that this is a family affair. So he did admit to the fact that there were issues, that these issues have been discussed and that they are discussed periodically, and that there may be some problems, but this is within the family and nothing to be worried about.
And how significant is it for the RSS to admit this? Because, like you said, they could have just denied it.
It's very significant because let's remember that after Mr. J.P. Nanda gave an interview to the Indian Express saying that we are now self-sufficient and we do not need the RSS, there was a lot of rancor between the RSS and the BJP behind closed doors. And the RSS workers were virtually demoralized. And this was seen that it was speculated at least that they did not come out with the same enthusiasm in the Lok Sabha elections as they were expected to, and did not mobilize the voters as much as was required, which was reflected in BJP's reduced number of seats in the polls. Having said that, the moment the results came, days after that, Mohan Bhagwat made one of the strongest statements about the BJP that you can imagine in the past 10 years. And he spoke about, although he generally talks in veiled references and never broaches any subject directly, but that's his style. And he suggested that BJP had become arrogant, especially its leadership had become arrogant. And this flowed from nowhere else for anyone who observes relations between BJP and the RSS. It flowed from nowhere else other than that JP Nanda interview, where he suggested that we are self-sufficient. So in that context, it is very, very significant that on a second occasion, when a question to this context is asked directly, the RSS does not deny. It says, fine, we have issues, but we'll resolve it. Because more or less, it has made its point with that Mohan Bhagwat speech. And there have been multiple meetings behind closed doors between BJP leaders and RSS. And these matters are being resolved. Let's also remember there are 4 very, very important assembly elections which are months away. And BJP, at a time when it has a reduced majority in Lok Sabha, would not want to lose any of them. And for that, it needs every man it can get. And so extending an olive branch with perhaps an apology is only the need of the hour.
And next we talk about Indian migrants and asylum seekers. Every year, thousands of undocumented Indians attempt to illegally enter the United States. And despite the fact that almost none of them are accepted, their numbers continue to rise. And for years, the most popular route for walk-ins and asylum seekers was through Mexico. But its place has now been overtaken by Canada. According to the latest US Customs and Border Protection data, 5,152 undocumented Indians crossed into the US from Canada on foot in June alone. In fact, compared to 2021, officials observed a 13-fold increase in 2023. When we spoke to Indian Express's Jay Mazoomdar, who reported on the story for the paper, he told us about this shift from Mexico to Canada.
Well, this happened over the last 5-6 years. The early trends are visible even before the COVID pandemic. So we see a jump sometime around 2022 when we see that there is a sharp rise. And at the time, the flow was more from the south through the Mexican side. And from 2023, the numbers were getting even and constantly rising. And finally, this year, from January onwards, the flow from the northern side has become more in numbers compared to the people coming in, the internationals coming in from the Mexican side.
Right, and Jay, we'll talk about the reasons for this, but could you talk about how do these people land up in Canada? Do they essentially just take a tourist or a student visa?
I think most of the cases would be student visa holders because around 2017, the Canadian government, they relaxed their visa norms to attract more students, and a good number of Indian students landed up there. And the move was to primarily encourage the education sector in Canada, and there was success. By 2018, it was clear that many of these visa holders, they're also looking for job opportunities inside of Canada, and the number of asylum seekers within Canada, asylum seekers among Indian nationals, that number also went up. And subsequently, I think opinions are divided, but some experts believe that the Canadian economy, they're not doing so well in the last few years. So many of these aspirants, they could not find jobs in Canada. So they thought the other option is to cross the border on foot without papers to the US. So that could be one bunch. But subsequently, when these things spread through words of mouth and when many realized that it's a much convenient option to take the Canadian route because the visa is easily accessible and the northern border with USA, the US's northern border with Canada is not heavily guarded because they never had any reason to guard it. In the past, ironically, the flow was usually northward from the US. People used to go to Canada to find jobs because there were more opportunities. The population was low. So they never had any reason to heavily guard the border, and the focus was always on the southern side, on the Mexican side. So these two things worked in tandem, that it was quite convenient and easy to land up in Canada with a student's visa. And then from there, it was, in comparison to the southern border, it was much easier to just walk in. And if you're lucky, and you could just slip through the system.
Right, and apart from the security being lax on the northern side, we also understand that the journey itself would be less treacherous compared to the Mexican side, right?
Yeah, so that's more to do with how you end up there, because before you cross the border from either side, you have to be there on the other side. So to reach the Mexican side, you have to take a very treacherous donkey route, which goes usually through North Africa or the Gulf countries and sometimes through some South American destinations. And there is already a large crowd waiting on the Mexican side, and you have to join the crowd, wait, and then take your chances against a highly fortified system, barriers. And compared to that, the northern side, you can just take a visa, take a flight, land up there, and reach up to the US border without any real risk. And then, since there is no armed protection, there's a good chance that you could make it across the border on foot. And that is how, in the last 4 or 5 years, this became quite popular.
And do we know why we are seeing this sort of rise now, and why so many more people are taking the Canadian route and seeking asylum in the US?
Well, that's not very clear. We don't have clear answers, but one can look at possible reasons, because we have a very strong, thriving, powerful diaspora in US where the population to tax contribution ratio is very high. So the Indian diaspora has its clout and they're doing very well. But this bunch of people who are going there without papers and taking this opportunity to just cross over and try their fortune, this could probably be possibly that the job opportunities, the options in India are not so great. And though this takes some amount of money, the people who are going there are not really poor, even by Indian standards. But as we learn from our sources, that many of them come from the landed gentry where they have assets, but because of growing family size and the finite plot size, so agriculture is probably not so viable anymore. And plus, there is a very strong presence of Indian diaspora in the US and also in Canada. So they get some kind of acceptance there also. So taken together, probably these are the two factors why these numbers are going up.
And Jay, you write that there are also Indian passengers bound for Canada who end up seeking asylum in the UK. Can you tell us how that ends up happening?
Well, that's something quite fascinating, because this is happening for the last 4 or 5 years. And some countries, they don't insist on a transit visa to pass through, to change a flight basically in transit. UK is one of those countries. And so what happened is that a few hundred Indians every year over the last few years, they are booking their tickets through UK to Canada. And then when they're landing there, during transit, they're seeking asylum. And I think this norm is there with a couple of other European countries as well, though we haven't covered that as part of our report. But there are unconfirmed claims that some other governments, like Finland, like Netherlands, so probably they have also red flagged this issue that people in transit en route to Canada, they're also seeking asylum at their airports.
And I mean, so does that give a sense that it's perhaps easier for people to get a Canadian visa than a UK visa?
It is, but at the same time, we have to remember after Brexit, getting a UK student's visa or tourist visa has become quite easy for Indians. So this indicates that even going by those relaxed standards, those who are taking this opportunity, taking this route, they probably wouldn't qualify for even those visa standards. So that gives us an indication that the background of the people who are taking this route, they are not really well-to-do. I mean, you have to show certain assets on record to go for tourist visa or student's visa if you want to enter UK. But probably in Canada, the standards are not that high. So probably they find it still easier to go for Canadian visa and then use that to reach UK and then seek asylum.
And since we are seeing this rise of people seeking asylum in the UK and entering the US through Canada, could you talk about what these two countries have done in response to this?
Well, it has become increasingly difficult in the last few years, and this issue is a very sensitive one in both countries, and it's not only about Indian nationals, but immigration overall. So if you don't have a UK visa, chances of getting asylum in UK is almost zero. The same is true in the US. So you have seen reports that when people arrive by small boats across the English Channel, very few of them at all stand any chance for asylum. And the same would be true for those who are coming to the airport and seeking asylum. But what probably works here is that people get to stay back due to pendency.
Wait, pendency as in people end up staying back because their cases are essentially pending with the immigration officers?
Yeah, that's true. So back to the other aspect that the UK has sought a practical solution that they have reportedly said to the Canadian authorities that they would require a double screening, like they would have the requirement for a UK transit visa to change flight on the way to Canada so that they can also get to vet the passengers that who are coming in to minimize these chances. So that's a practical solution there. But when it comes to the US, it's a little more complicated because it's a very long open border. And in the recent years, we have seen there is political pressure also inside the US. We have a Northern Caucus where the lawmakers are voicing their concerns on this issue, and they're seeking stronger armed vigil along the northern border. And this is a new trend, and I think from the sense I got from the experts that the government will take some time to plug this side because the entire focus for long has been on the southern side.
And in the end, we talk about a case involving this very newspaper. A case that dates all the way back to the emergency. The 21-month period between 1975 and 1977, which saw the suspension of civil liberties, mass arrests, the cancellation of elections, and the restriction on press freedom. This was the time when newspapers were subjected to pre-censorship. The press council was abolished, and more than 250 journalists, including Kuldeep Nair of the Indian Express, were sent to jail. Now, the Indian Express was among the few that resisted the emergency, fought the regulations in court, and printed blank spaces when their stories were pre-censored. All of this, of course, happened under the Congress-led Indira Gandhi government, which fell in 1977 but then came back to power in 1980. And this is when it started taking coercive actions against those who had fought back, which included the Indian Express.
So it was 1975, the emergency, and then we see this happening in 1980.
That's Indian Express's Sohini Ghosh.
And Express is famously known for running a blank page when their electricity were cut off from the printing press, as were of several other publications during the emergency. But the entire round of litigation starts a little after that. So going a little back, in 1980, basically we have a new LG in Delhi, the Lieutenant Governor, who was Jagmohan back then. He is appointed in February 17, 1980, and right within 3 days, the Express newspapers, they receive show cause notice from the LG's office, basically saying that they want to take control of these two buildings or rather the two plots on Bahadur Shah Zafar Marg, which were leased out to Express publication. And the grounds that were cited were illegal use, unauthorized construction, change of use, etc., etc.
And what's key to note is that the paper back then had written critically about the LG. because of his role in a slew of demolitions that took place during and after the emergency.
I mean, this is part of the court records in an earlier case where the Express publication had argued that this kind of coercive action that started coming in with the notices, show cause notices, and eventually the re-entry, or rather, which means taking back possession of the plot notices, these were attributed to Express's critical coverage of Jagmohan's moves post or during emergency.
She says upon receiving the notices, the Express newspapers challenged them before the Supreme Court.
And Supreme Court had practically set aside those notices and held that the constructions or the use change were not unauthorized or illegal. And it became a ruling in Express Publications' favor in 1985. So the judgment was by a 3-judge bench of the Supreme Court. And there were certain observations, very clear-cut observations on press freedom, and how these actions you could make out was clearly retaliatory step against Express back then.
The court told the government that it was free to contest the matter in a civil suit, and this did not require the repossession of the plots. But despite the Supreme Court order, the paper continued to receive notices from the government. And so the matter was then challenged in the Delhi High Court, which after 43 years finally ruled on it last week.
So now the Delhi High Court, what they have basically said is that we are, of course, bound by the Supreme Court judgment, number one. Number two, the Union of India's argument that the 3 judges spoke in different voices is not a tenable argument, because there's no clear-cut observation there which says I dissent or I agree with this opinion. Ultimately, when we look at the conclusion of the Supreme Court judgment, it speaks in one voice, and that is something that Delhi High Court recognized and put an end to the litigation and made it very clear that the only option that Union of India had was to litigate this in a civil suit and not seek re-entry or repossession of these plots again in 1986 and 7. So basically the court started its judgment with this Nelson Mandela quote about a free press is one of the pillars of democracy. And it went on to kind of reiterate that these notices, the second round of notices that the government had sent out despite the Supreme Court verdict, was nothing but an attempt by the then government to muzzle the press and dry up its sources of income.
Now we welcome you to our Teachers' Day segment in association with CSF. With over 26.5 crore school-going children attending over 15 lakh schools and being taught by 95 lakh teachers, it is safe to say India has one of the largest and most complex education systems in the world. To streamline this process, the Central Square Foundation, or CSF, has been working dedicatedly towards enhancing the learning outcomes of all school-going children across India by working with different state governments for system-led reforms. In this part of the episode, I, Niharika Nanda, begin by speaking to Ujjawala Meshram, who is a teacher in a multi-grade, multi-level classroom in foundational literacy and numeracy for grades 1 and 2 in Madhya Pradesh. This part of the conversation will be in Hindi. उज्ज्वला जी, क्या आप मुझे बताएंगी कि आपके अंदर एक टीचर बनने की, एक शिक्षक बनने की चाहत कैसे आई? क्या आपके साथ कोई ऐसी घटना हुई थी जिसने आपको एक टीचर बनने का प्रोत्साहन दिया?
मुझे टीचर बनना तो बहुत ही पसंद था, क्योंकि जो परेशानी हमने झेले थे शायद वो अभी ना हो बच्चों के साथ में। और जो शिक्षक का जीवन होता है वो एकदम खुले विचारों वाला होता है। वो बच्चों के साथ में हर चीज शेयर करते हैं और बच्चे भी उनके साथ में अपनत्व की भावना रखते हैं। यही सोच करके मैंने टीचरशिप को चुना है और उसी को ही पहले मैंने प्राथमिकता दी। क्या है, अपने जो छोटे छोटे नन्हे मुन्ने बच्चे होते हैं उनको एक माँ की आवश्यकता होती है, न कि टीचर की। और मैंने उन्हें माँ की ही तरह पाला है और उन्हें संजोगा है और वो बहुत ही अच्छे अपनत्व की भावना से जुड़े हुए हैं। इसलिए मैंने शिक्षक को ही चुना है। कहा जाता है कि मैंने सुना भूल गया, मैंने देखा याद रहा, मैंने किया सीख गया। ये बहुत ही महत्वपूर्ण है, जो करके सीखने में बच्चों की समझ जल्दी विकसित होती है। उन्हें ही छोटे-छोटे टेलर और सीखने में जो आनंद आता है, वह किसी भी कार्य को करने में नहीं आता। यही कारण है कि मैंने शिक्षा विभाग को पहले प्राथमिकता दी हूँ। और घटना तो घटी है, ऐसी घटना घटी थी हमारे साथ में। क्या है, पहले समय में जब हम पढ़ते तो हमको बहुत दूर रखा जाता था। हमारे भी साथ वही किया करते थे पहले के टीचर। पर वो घटना शायद आज के समय में बच्चों के साथ ना हो, ये मन में बहुत गहरी असर डाल दिया था कि ये दोबारा किसी बच्चे के साथ ना हो। क्योंकि गरीब वर्ग के बच्चे ही सरकारी स्कूलों में पढ़ते हैं और हम भी सरकारी ही स्कूल में पढ़ कर के टीचर बने हैं।
जी, और जो आपको टीचर गाइड्स मिलती हैं, उससे पढ़ाने में कितना फर्क आया है और बच्चों के लिए सीखना कितना आसान हुआ है?
जो हमें टीचर गाइड से दी गई है, शिक्षक संदर्शिका में जो स्केल फोल्डिंग है, आई डू, वी डू और यू डू, एवं जो गणित में CCPA के माध्यम से जो सीखने सिखाने की प्रक्रिया को बेहतर बनाती है। शिक्षक संदर्शिका की पाठ योजना में बच्चों को विभिन्न प्रकार से सीखने के जो अवसर दिए जाते हैं, यह शिक्षक संदर्शिका में दिया हुआ है। जो पहले रोटन पद्धति होती थी, रटने की पद्धति को दूर करके समझने के साथ पढ़ना एवं संख्या ज्ञान को समझने में उत्साहित करता है। जो बच्चों को सरलता से सीखने एवं मुझे बच्चों में आसानी होती है सिखाने में। इसमें जो बच्चों के परिवेश से जुड़ी छोटी-छोटी जो कहानियां हैं, उनकी जो मातृभाषा, जो अपने गांव की क्षेत्रीय भाषा है, उसके आधार पर दी हुई है और उन्हीं के परिवेश से जुड़ी है, तो मेरे को शिक्षण कार्य में बहुत मदद मिलती है इसके माध्यम से। ये जो अपने जो शिक्षक संदर्शिका आई है, जो गवर्नमेंट की तरफ से हमें मिला है, वो बहुत ही एक प्रकार सुदृढ़ यानी कि शिक्षकों के लिए बहुत ही अच्छी बुक्स है वो, जो हमें दी गई है। बच्चों को बहुत आसानी होती है मैम, बहुत ही सरलता से। उसमें बहुत छोटे-छोटे कहानियाँ दी गई है। वो जो छोटे-छोटे कहानियाँ जो आई है हमारे पास में, इसके पहले जो आती थी बरखा सीरीज है और भी अन्य बुकें पुस्तकालय के लिए दी जाती है। जो उसमें जो पुस्तकालय में जो बुकें थी, उसमें बरखा सीरीज तो सबसे अच्छी माध्यम है 1 से 5 के बच्चों के लिए। छोटी-छोटी कहानियाँ, उन्हीं के परिवेश से जुड़ी हुई थी पूरी बुकें, और जो इसमें भी दी है, उसमें भी जो छोटी-छोटी कहानियाँ हैं, जो घरों में जानवर है अपने या हमारे जो परिवेश से जुड़ी हुई चीजें हैं, वो सब उन कहानियों में दर्शाया गया है। तो बच्चे बहुत आकर्षित होते हैं और फिर उससे वो सीखते हैं, पढ़ना भी सीखते हैं। और चित्रों को तो ऐसे वो अपनी कल्पनाओं के आधार पर जो मनोभाव जो दिखाते हैं ना, उससे बहुत ही जल्दी सीखने की कोशिश करते हैं।
जी, और उज्ज्वला जी, जो नेशनल एजुकेशन पॉलिसी है, उसके हिसाब से बच्चों को अपनी मातृभाषा में पढ़ना चाहिए। तो एक टीचर होने के नाते क्या आप मुझे बता सकती हैं कि क्या बच्चों को अपनी मातृभाषा में पढ़ने से मदद हो रही है?
हाँ मैम, बहुत मदद मिलती है उससे, और उनके लिए तो मैं कहूँगी कि बहुत ही अच्छी सामग्री मिली है, बहुत ही अच्छा दिया गया है। जब बच्चा स्कूल आता है तो वो अपनी मातृभाषा साथ में लेकर के आता है मैम। अब यदि उसे उसकी भाषा से पढ़ाने की कोशिश करेंगे तो बच्चों की आधी से ज्यादा एनर्जी है वो नई भाषा सीखने में लग जाएगी और बच्चे ज्यादातर समय तक कंफ्यूजन में रहेंगे मैम। इसलिए भाषा केवल सीखने का एक माध्यम है मैम, भाषा पूरा ज्ञान नहीं है, इसका दूसरा पहलू भी है हमारे पास। जैसे मातृभाषा में पढ़ाने से अभिभावकों की सहभागिता बच्चे के सीखने की प्रक्रिया से बढ़ जाती है, क्योंकि अभिभावक भी उनको घरेलू भाषा अपनी क्षेत्रीय भाषा के माध्यम से बताते हैं और हम भी उन्हें उनकी भाषाओं से पहले जोड़ करके ही बताते हैं। तो बच्चों की सीखने की जो प्रक्रिया है वो इससे बेहतर बनती है।
जी, और उज्ज्वला जी, आप इतने सालों से मिशन अंकुर के अंतर्गत शिक्षक रही हैं। आपके रोज के रूटीन में किस प्रकार की चुनौतियों का आपको सामना करना पड़ता है?
जब भी कोई अगर नई पॉलिसी या नया चीज आता है अपने विभाग में, उसका वो किया जाता है, अपने को क्या कहना चाहिए उसको दिखाया जाता है, वो बच्चों के वो साथ में उसको प्रैक्टिकली किया जाता है। तो इस दौर में तो दिक्कतें बहुत आती, कोई भी चीज अपनाने में हमें शुरुआती दौर में तो दिक्कतें आती है, लेकिन मिशन अंकुर के अंतर्गत राज्य शिक्षा केंद्र भोपाल द्वारा जो समय समय पर शिक्षकों की कठिनाइयों को दूर करने के लिए निरंतर प्रशिक्षण दिए जा रहे हैं। हर साल होते हैं में गाइड से जाएंगे, पहले अपने जो अपने प्रशिक्षण देने वाले सर लोग जाते हैं, DRG लोग वो लेकर के आते हैं, फिर वो हमें प्रशिक्षण देते हैं। तो इसमें क्या है, हर बार नया नया सीखने को मिलता है। तो इससे क्या है, हमारा जो कठिनाइयां है वो दूर होते रहती है। साथ ही में जो शिक्षक संदर्शिका में दी गई पाठ योजना एवं जो TLM सामग्री जो सीखने एवं सिखाने की गतिविधियों को आसान बनाती है। ये तो मैं कहूंगी कि इन जो हमारी जो कठिनाई है, जो चुनौतियां है, इनको भी दूर करती है। और मैंने जो अपने स्कूलों में TLM बना है, वेस्ट मटेरियल से पूरी जीरो बैलेंस पर है। अपने पास जो कोई भी सामग्री आती है, उनसे मैंने TLM का उनके परिवेश से जुड़ी हुई ही निर्माण किया, ताकि बच्चे को सिखाने में भी मेरे को चुनौतियों का सामना ना करना पड़े और बच्चे आसानी से सीख जाए।
And now we are joined by Vinod Karate, Project Director, Foundational Learning Reforms at CSF, to discuss effective teaching practices and the recent advancements in classroom methods. Vinod, if we talk about teaching, can you tell us about the science of learning in a classroom and why is it important for a teacher?
I mean, it's super important, especially in early grades where foundational literacy and numeracy is taught. Now, when it comes to science of teaching, there are three levels to it. First is at a child development level, right? There's enough research now which points out that children in early years make a lot of connections in their brain, and they're well suited to pick up these foundational literacy and numeracy skills. And as they grow old and cross that age, it becomes further and further difficult. So it becomes super crucial that we are supporting the children who are coming into primary schools to pick up this skill. So that's one part of the science. The second big part of science of teaching is how literacy and numeracy ideas are picked up by children. There is enormous evidence that there are certain pedagogical methodologies which work fantastically. For example, in numeracy, there is this idea that if you introduce a concept like number or place value right from a formula, children usually just remember the formula but doesn't understand the concept. So what they call out is that you should start with concretizing the idea first, then let the child pictorially understand it, and then eventually blend into formalization or abstraction. So CPA is a kind of pedagogy which is quite prevalent in mathematics. Literacy is even harder. You can imagine that at home children start speaking and listening, but understanding the sound association of a certain letter and alphabet and then blending them together, there usually what works is what is called a balanced literacy approach. So the pedagogical choice that one should make in classrooms should have this kind of where all these skills of listening, reading, writing, speaking, and what they call coding, decoding. And the last level is more peculiar to our government schools, especially in large scale systems where outcomes are so poor. And we all know in India, close to 53% children cross grade 5 without picking these foundational skills. What is known to work is what is called structured pedagogy, that you introduce structured lesson plans which inculcate all of these signs of learning and support teachers to kind of follow that through training and a lot of encouragement and continuously assess children week on week. So these are the three aspects which fall in the bracket of science of teaching FLN.
Right. And talking particularly about Madhya Pradesh, what are some of the changes in classroom practices that are taking place in the schools there?
So a lot actually. So we work very closely with the leadership in MP. During COVID is when this Nipun Bharat mission was launched, and in MP it is called the Mission Ankur. For example, and as Ujjawala, the teacher in MP, said about the teacher guides, MP has also introduced teacher guides, which allows teachers to teach with plan, which also provides structured lesson plans on a daily basis, which teachers can easily follow, sufficiently reducing the burden on their planning, but at the same time giving them good, high quality activities which are tested, which work. So they've introduced that. They have introduced a lot of FLN linked materials. For example, young children have to read certain graded textbooks. They need to read big books. So state has ensured that as part of the mission have provisioned for it, there is a sufficient amount of such specialized books are available. On top of it, what the state has done is they've built an app which is used by a mentor who visits the school once a month and sits with the teacher, observes her, does a quick spot assessment of 3-4 children, picks up that data in that app so that, the state is also able to understand what is actually happening in all the schools with respect to teaching as well as the material. And something unique which no other state has done as part of the mission is to strengthen the district and district's ability to really support blocks. They've introduced a fellowship where they have hired a Nipun professional, what they call, where they have hired a young person to come as part of the Nipun Bharat program and is placed in a district. So they work very, very closely with the district and the block officials And MP has ensured that there is one such fellow present in every single district. So there are some 52 fellows who are part of the mission right now supporting the implementation.
And Vinod, is there any learning level data that indicates that teaching in the classroom is showing some green shoots of progress?
So as part of the mission, what MP has committed is to run an annual assessment where every year they statistically pick some schools in each district and send a third party to go and do a sample assessment of children and then analyze what is their health. Now, MP has just finished the second round of that exercise. So we are seeing some very interesting early green shoots. For example, in 2022, there were a lot of children who were not able to answer even a single question. That number is reducing significantly in the 2024 round. There is a specific benchmark called oral reading fluency. So, for example, in Hindi, in order to read with understanding, anybody has to read at a speed of 35 words per minute or 45 words per minute. That's a range. If you read slower than that, you are basically reading but not understanding. And if you read too fast, also, you will not understand. You will just read. So, in 2024, in grade 3, there are close to around 39% children who are meeting that benchmark, which is far better than what it was in 2022, which was hovering around 15-17%. So early signs, especially in literacy, we are seeing early gains. Numeracy also, addition without carry is showing significant progress. The close to around 40% children are able to do that. Whereas with carryover, we still need a way to go. So given it's a 5-year mission with COVID, etc., 2 years of implementation, early signs are already visible. We are waiting for next year to see in terms of how things really take off.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar and was produced by Niharika Nanda and me, Shashank Bhargava. If you liked the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way to get to know about us. You can also tweet us at Express Audio and write to us at podcast@indianexpress.com.